Hey, this is Austin with Mamba Woodworks. Tried my hand at an Epoxy River Serving Tray. This is kind of the precursor, for me anyway, to building up to those big tables. But I definitely walked through the whole process for other beginners out there who might be looking at this. Everything from how to build a mold, to how to select and pour my epoxy, to everything about that I know about finishing these things. Really enjoyed this process. I think you'll pick some up along the way. As always, thanks for coming, Mamba Woodworks. Just like with the last live edge project I did, the first step with any of these is taking off the live edge. So you got to go ahead and, chisel it off. And then, of course, I come back with the belt sander again. Same thing as the first video I did if you watched it. So this should look pretty familiar. This is the part, is my first new step on this project. As you can see, this board is warped. So I did this old trick that I saw on 3x3 Customs. She did a great version of this where you get a flat reference edge of just MDF or really anything, put a little stop on it, and then hot glue it down, run it through the planer, and that gives me my flat top edge. Then I flip this thing over and just run it through like I would normally. It works perfectly. I was intimidated about it the first time because I wasn't really sure how well it was going to work. It worked perfectly. It was like I had a joiner. It was great. So it worked well. As you can see, there it is, perfectly flat, both sides. Wonderful. A thumbs up. So the next part of the project is creating the outside edges of the serving tray. And to do that, I've got to get a line straight down the middle of this board that doesn't have a straight edge. So I use a little trick I saw in 731 Woodworks. I'm practicing the cut here, but you can see the reference edge on the table saw fence there is a Bora straight edge guide. I got it at Lowe's. It's super awesome. I use it whenever I'm cutting plywood at home. And basically you use that as your artificial fake edge, and you get a straight line down the middle of your board. Works perfectly every single time. And I don't want to throw this Kobalt miter saw under the bus, but this Kobalt miter saw doesn't stay square very well. And if the Kobalt miter saw that I have did stay straight, I probably wouldn't mention that the Kobalt miter saw that I have doesn't stay square. Okay, this is the least exciting part of making any kind of a river table or serving board. But it was the part that I was the most nervous about because you get all these warnings that if you make any mistakes on your mold, you're going to lose a bunch of epoxy and then you're going to cost yourself a fortune. And that's true, absolutely. But how big should I make it? If I make it wider all the way to the edge of this piece of melamine I've got, then that means I'm going to have a wider river here, which means more epoxy. Too narrow, it's going to look kind of straight. So just split the difference right down the middle, basically. I also have to keep in mind my planer, which is 13-inch capacity. So I'm going to go probably about 12.5 inches from end to end on each of these things. That way I know I've got a decent sized river here for whatever color I put in there. And that I know I'm going to have something that, one, I can get through my planer, but two, it's not going to take up all of my melamine. So I feel like that's the splitting the difference there. That's going to work. Now, you can buy these things at any closet part of a home goods store. I got this at Lowe's and I'm making my own closet or whatever. So that's all this is, just a piece of white melamine. I'm going to cut it down on my miter saw, and then you got to build the walls and put it all together. So that'll be the next part of this process. There we go. Now I will sure this up, of course, but just to give myself a rough measurement to know where to start this, I'm going to give myself just a little corner mark. So I have a basic understanding of where to start this process, and I'm not pulling my tape measure out with every single move here. All right. So the next part of building the mold is cutting the walls up. I came over to the miter saw and cross-cut this scrap melamine, the rest of it that I had, and then ripped down the sides on the table saw. You have to wear a mask and glasses when you're doing the melamine. The dust is everywhere, and it's really, it's just plastic, right? So it's just flying all over the place. So I'm super careful about this. Using those reference lines, those little corners I drew on there, the first thing I'm going to do to make this mold is get a good solid bead of caulk. And this first one is just to adhere it. So I'm just going to get it to stick on in the right spot and then come back, and you'll see in a second. Try not to get too much on the inside of this thing. Okay, there we go. I don't want this thing to move around, but I also don't want to flip it over. So I'm just going to go ahead and brad nail these in upside down here. And you can see the way this thing lines up, I'm gonna use that as my reference edge, and then I'm good to go. I come back and I reinforce it with some screws in the bottom. So there's that, and then of course a bead of caulk on the inside of the mold itself. So one more thing you have to do with these serving boards or river tables or whatever is you have to seal this live edge with just standard tabletop epoxy first to make sure that you're not getting any bubbles coming out or anything that's gonna mess up your final pour. You don't want bubbles in there. That's like the death of any good river table. So I'm gonna go ahead and just measure these out. Again, all I need is the tabletop version. I don't need the deep pour stuff. So I'm gonna use this. Now before I started doing a lot more woodworking, I did a lot of boat repair. And in doing a lot of boat repair, you learn the value of measuring your epoxies and resins perfectly. So I use a little scale, just a digital scale. You could grab these pretty much at any craft store. And I don't need a lot, I'm just gonna be brushing it on. So luckily this Total Boat stuff is just a 1-to-1 ratio. Perfect, excellent. Mix that up, brush it on like you would kind of paint or anything else. You're just trying to seal, lacquer, something like that on the edge. And then I'm gonna let that dry overnight before I go into the next step. See you tomorrow. Okay, next steps. We have let the epoxy dry here on the live edge board. Live edge part of this board anyway. The plan now is to clean out the mold. I finally got something that I've been waiting to try instead of using all the tape, is a polyvinyl alcohol. It's a mold release. So for those of you guys who've used it, let's hear about it. For those of you guys who haven't, you've been using the tape instead. This is my first time, so we're about to find out how well or how poorly this works. We'll find out. Looking forward to it. Bought it cheap off Amazon. We'll see what happens. Anyway, clean this out, coat it, put these guys in there, mix up some epoxy and pour it in. So that's gonna be the next process that you see for today. So I added the mold release, and again, first time using it, I did put another coat on after this, but the sprayer itself wasn't working real well. And as you will soon see, it did not turn out like I'd hoped. I used the liquid glass epoxy this time with that black diamond pigment. I love this combination of epoxy. Specifically the liquid glass worked perfectly. It hit every single mark with the timing of it all that I was hoping for. So it was actually probably ready in under 72 hours. So that was nice as well. But I waited for the full time just to make sure I didn't mess it up. And as you'll see with this epoxy project and any other one, the bubbles show up. So you come back afterward with a butane torch. In this case, I probably went over this 3 or 4 times over about an hour period just to be sure that any bubbles that were there were gone. Okay, so here we are. 3 days. 3 days until it's done curing. We'll find out how it goes. Not sure I like the dark color as much as I like the blue, but we'll find out. You really can't tell with these until after they're all finished up. So, see you then. Okay, it's been 72 hours, and I came back out here to pop it out of the mold. Quickly realized that the mold release didn't release as well as I'd have hoped. You can see a lot of this particle board is still stuck on the actual serving tray, which is a bummer. So I'm gonna have to take the time to scrape that all off or chisel that all off. Totally salvageable. It didn't hurt or ruin the project, but it definitely is going to add to my work time. So I have to factor that in when I'm trying to think about trying to put these into a batch and mass produce them anyway. So that's a no-go. I should have used the tape. I've never not used the tape, as I said. Gonna use the tape moving forward. It could have been my application. I don't know yet, so I'll probably test it again and see. But in the meantime, I have some work to do. So I ended up just using a chisel and my rubber mallet to take off the bulk of this stuff. It really wasn't that hard. And once I got the biggest stuff off, I just ended up taking it over to the planer to take off the top and bottom faces of it. You always get a little bit of epoxy bleed out, and as I said, you know, being under the capacity for the total planer, I was able to get most of this done in probably about 10 passes. Then I came over and ripped off one of the edges here. Luckily, I was able to just flip it around and do the same, and then just cross-cut both of the ends to find myself in a much better position. Finally, I came over and it was sanding and finishing time. So one of the things you can probably see on the board here is these tiny little pits. And those little pits are, from the best that I can tell, coming from the planer, but it's not that big of a deal. Basically, the secret here is to use a little CA glue to fill those tiny little voids. I'm just putting tiny little amounts in these tiny pits. I try to get as many as possible because you're about to see that I spray it afterward with an aerosol, and I'd rather not do a ton of that. Voila, those are going to turn into hardened plastic in no time. So, you know, give it a couple seconds and I can sand those down right away. You can see it evaporating that quickly. This isn't sped up at all. So, you know, it's kind of a pain in the ass, but it makes it look just totally flush, like a nice flat surface, which is ideal. So I brought it over to just sand off the I guess the peaks of that CA glue, and it didn't take long. So I got that nice and flat. And then this is my sanding process. I go against the grain, up and down, and then I go on a 45-degree diagonal one direction, flip it over and go 45-degree diagonal the other direction, and then finally I go with the grain. This makes my surface perfect. Finally, I came over and did my edge profiling. Did a 45-degree chamfer on the bottom edge, and then an 1/8-inch roundover on the top edge, the face that people are going to be putting serving items on. I like the look of this. It's best for me. Okay, so after we've sanded everything, and we've gone up to about 320, I'm using some Rubi Monocoat as a nice finishing coat. It does say you shouldn't go as high, but when I went down, in terms of your sandpaper grits, I went a little bit lower last time and I didn't like the finish. So I went up to 320, made sure that I did a little mineral spirit bath over it to clean it off, no dust. And now I'm going to apply my Rubi Monocoat here. So anyone who's used Rubi Monocoat will know that I've just put way too much of this stuff on. And you will also know that this is expensive stuff. It's great finish, it works perfectly, but it's expensive. So using any more than you need to is not great. I did use some of the excess and flip it over on the other side, but even still, I kind of get why much less is used with a buffer now. So after a while, after I've really tried to kind of push this into the grain, and I use my hand, I just feel like I don't have to deal with the cleanup for other stuff. I'm just trying to get a heavy coat on this. And once I do, and you can see that it's pretty well coated, I will let this sit according to the directions. You know, I usually let it sit for somewhere between, I would say, 5 to 10 minutes. And then once I do that, I come back and I wipe all the excess off. So the stories are true. You really can't take enough of this stuff off. I have left a little bit too much on before, and it will harden, and it will leave something you have to come back and try to finish later. So I really am careful to take every single little drop of this off after I've applied it the first time. I use just a dry towel first, and then I come back with a microfiber towel, and then I come back again with like a shop rag and make sure I get every single piece of this thing, the edges and the sides, the top and the bottom face. It makes a big difference. The work's already been done if you let it sit on there, so the finish already looks good, and then you just leave it. Okay, I let it cure overnight, probably for about 16 to 18 hours. It really turned out nicely. I'm very, very happy with how this looked. I do like the darker color. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about it, but after the finishing, it's growing on me. So the next step here is, I know it says Rubi Monocoat, but there's no question that a little bit of sanding and then a second coat, one more cure overnight, usually does the trick. So I'm going to go ahead and get going with that. So as you'll see, I kind of replicate the exact steps from the first coat here. Light sanding followed by the Monocoat application, and then wiping all the excess off. When I make these serving trays, I know that it's not going to be food on this surface. I expect there to be plates on there, maybe even like napkins or whatever, but not necessarily food. So I'm okay with using a non-food safe finish. And usually for non-food safe, I use a wipe-on polyurethane. That's my go-to. But the Rubi Monocoat leaves a flat finish on the epoxy. And for some reason, I really like the way that looks. The sheen is just not my preference whenever there's epoxy present, particularly with a pigment that's this dark. Okay, we let it dry overnight, and as you can see, it looks pretty good. I'm pleased with how the color turned out. Good. So I'm gonna drill this thing out in the drill press, and we're good to go. One of my favorite parts about this drill press I have is the good old, and you might not be able to see this on the video, but the crisscross target sights there, laser sight. So there's that makes things a lot easier and more accurate to line up here. The last one that I had was a lot cheaper and did not work quite as well. So anytime I'm using my drill press and doing something that has high revolutions, just drilling a hole, I don't usually clamp the piece down. Anytime I'm using a Forstner bit or something with low revolutions, I absolutely will clamp the piece down. Probably not good practice. I should probably clamp it either way, but I've gotten away with it this far anyway. So I did both ends of it, and then finally came over and decided to do rubber feet on the bottom. I probably didn't have to do rubber feet, but I decided to because you never know what surface this is going to be on. That's a little jig I built to make sure that the hole is exactly 1 inch by 1 inch from the edge. And then, you know, come back over. I like these rubber feet. You could buy them in bulk on Amazon, but it adds a nice professional look and also protects both the piece itself and the piece that you're putting it on, whatever that may be. I decided to end up, I came back at the end here and countersunk the handle, the top, so I should say, of the bolts for the handles. That was an afterthought. I probably should have done that first, but came back afterward anyway, and really I'm glad I did. I think it looked much better when they're countersunk like that. Okay, there it is. Front to back, top to bottom. You got to see this process. Definitely a learning experience. Every time I do one of these, I learn something more, whether or not I like the dark color, or a little bit more about my finishing process, whether or not I'm going to use these handles or have Jay rake me over the coals and realize that I need to use the wooden ones. Either way, I'm becoming quite fond of the Epoxy River thing. They do seem a little bit played out these days. They're kind of everywhere, so I'm trying to figure out what my variation on this theme is going to be. But in the meantime, they are a fun project, and if you're looking to get into the tables themselves, start with something like this. Makes it a lot easier. I think this is my 4th one total, and definitely feel like I'm getting to a more consistent place. So hope you had fun, hope you learned something. Mambo Woodworks.